Thank you. Yeah, it feels very weird that I didn't have to hook up like cameras and all kinds of like gadgets to my computer because that's what usually I talk about. But yeah, hello. Welcome to DevRelCon Tokyo and welcome to my talk, which is an OSS field guide, and we'll talk about each part of that thing a little bit later. It's a field guide to interacting with a large open source contributor community. If you've never done that, probably it might be time for you to start. If you have done, I'm going to share some of my experiences so you can we can compare notes. So who is this guy standing here? First of all, allow me to introduce you my there you go. Yeah, allow me to introduce you my co-presenter Bela the Fox. So my name is István Szmozsánszky, so now you know why it's Flocky, just for short. I'm in Twitter at SL Softworks if you want to tweet at me. I'm a front-end trainer and a web technology consultant, and I do work with Mozilla's DevRel team evangelizing modern web technologies or cutting-edge web technologies like from WebAssembly to WebVR to all kinds of things, so mostly on the web things. And as was mentioned before, I tinker a lot with hardware, especially like to do JavaScript on microcontrollers. So if you are into that kind of stuff, I can show you some things later if you find me. And I'm as Alex Lakatos. Who has seen Alex Lakatos' talk? Just here. Okay, so everybody who haven't seen the talk, you just go, I will wait, because I'm referring to some of that. Oh, it's not recorded yet. Okay, so you just watch it later. I'm a Mozilla Tech speaker, which is a Mozilla project that is very similar to various ambassador programs you have even heard about earlier today. I will talk about this a bit later. So what's OSS? I'm going to talk about open source software and most importantly open source communities surrounding these open source software. And not necessarily going to go with the textbook definition or the open source movement or all that. It's more like I'm going to go with a more down-to-earth version of the thing. And what's a community? Like basically any stakeholders that you're going to be interacting with during your product cycles or your product development as a developer relations or developer engineer. So here's the thing, if you don't think you have a community, you're probably wrong. Everybody, even if you are, you don't think, oh, I'm not using open source software. Open source software, you don't just have an open source community if you, like Facebook, developing something in-house and decide to spread it on the internet and release it like React or like a bunch of open source libraries that big companies have released as open source software. That's not the only way to become a stakeholder in the open source business. You might be depending on some modules or open source libraries or any kind of other software that's developed in an open source manner. Think about just software or Linux itself. That your that your team, that your product, that your company is actually using. So, but you don't even have to be using software. You're like, okay, I'm not depending on any of that software. Let's say you're like a services company. You're providing an API. So that API is basically an interface for people to interact with. So even if you're not providing, or if you're providing like a wrapper to that API, imagine that people are going to be building like wrappers to obscure languages that you're not providing support for and maybe releasing them as open source. So you're going to be having people have to deal with the open source community anyway. Having an open source community is not a bad thing actually, so you shouldn't be worried about that. Having an open source community is a great opportunity for open source contributions, and contributions come in a lot of ways. Just like the very basic ones are like people filing bug reports or like sending you issues. Whether that's like people pinging you on Twitter or like actually having a bug tracker service that you actually use. But it goes way further than that. You have contributions. People might be reviewing the code that you are using. from a security perspective, or like testing on like obscure devices or platforms. And eventually, if you are actually using some software that's developed in an open source manner, people outside of your company actually can contribute back and file fixes and improve on the software that you are using. So having an open source community is a good thing. So knowing about you having an open source community can help you, because it's important to know, when you know that you have an open source community, you know what's at stake, so you can help support this open source community. So this is there are a lot of ways and to support this open source community. I'm not saying you should depend on open source software, just reap all the benefits of open source software, as many companies do these days, without giving back to the community. What you should definitely do is support the work of these communities around open source software that you're interacting with. And this could be multiple ways again. You can provide, people are filing issues and you have an issue tracker. Again, this doesn't have to be your thing that you built and now open source. It can be something that you are using and depending on. Providing people issue triage, for example. Providing contributor documentation, like having your people write documentation. Like Alex Lakatos said, like he knows, he's in DevRel, but he knows their APIs in and out, so he started writing documentation. This is, and like the most important thing about all of these is to give your people, like people working for your company, time to do this, so they don't have to do this on their own time. You cannot expect your employees to work on things that actually help your company grow in their free time. I mean, if you're going to do that, they're going to burn out, and eventually they're going to stop contributing. And the same goes for the open source contributors around you. Everybody who works on open source on their free time, they have their own reasons. Maybe they're getting something out of it. Maybe they're going to get like a conference talk proposal out of it, or maybe it's just they are using that project themselves, so it's important for them to contribute. But what's super important for you is to support the contributors, not just inside your company by giving them time, but outside your company. And how you can do that, there are various ways that you can figure out what is the best way about your community. Obviously, it depends on your product or your company that you're working on. I have some examples in the slides about lowering the barrier of entry to contributions around your software. This is Firefox developer tools. If you ever use Firefox, you can open like the developer console in the browser that lets you access to the HTML and JavaScript and all the code running in the browser. So Firefox is a desktop application, but this particular part of the code inside Firefox is part of the UI, yet it's built in open source web technologies. It's not just HTML and JavaScript. So you can, if you know HTML and JavaScript, you can contribute. It actually uses open source software like React and modern development practices to develop the software. So anybody who knows like JavaScript development and modern web application development, they can contribute to the source code of the browser. This lowers the barrier of entry on the technology side, but lowering the barrier of entry is not just important for the technology side. Open source is eventually about people, just like Soylent Green. So eventually you would want to have inclusive practices on your open source projects. And open sourcing something, putting something on the internet doesn't make it automatically welcoming. You would have to work your butt off to make sure that you're making your project easily contributable and easy for people to interact with, and they have a good experience while doing so. Because eventually these people are giving up their free time, so you want to make sure that they give up a small amount of their free time as possible. Servo is a project of Firefox also. It's powering, parts of it are powering the new Firefox Quantum engine. It's basically a browser engine rebuilt from scratch in a new programming language called Rust. What's super interesting about it, they have like a very inclusive community that is like based on the Rust programming language itself, was born with very inclusivity in mind. And it has, they expose, like the creators of this expose a starter issues or like easy issues that they have a website you could go to if you want to start contributing to an open source project. Servo might be a good project because you get mentored easy project bugs that the people will guide you through in order to familiarize yourself with the code base and start contributing to the project, and ramp up and be able to do harder projects, harder problems, and solve them yourselves. This is in the very interest of the project because this is the kind of problem that give a man a fish or teach them to fish. This is the same difference. You want to cater for your contributor communities, and I'm not going to talk too much about it because Manish Gorakhar, who works on the Servo core team, has an excellent keynote on how can you make your personal projects more inclusive and more welcoming. So the slides will be linked later on, so you can have a look if you are interested in this. And okay, what's in this for me? What's in this for my company? How do I sell this to my company? And I'm not gonna say you should treat people contributing to a project as a human person just because you want to hire them eventually. But it actually happens quite a lot, and we have seen like examples for it. I'm gonna show you a few examples already. It actually makes a perfect dynamic because your open source contributors, either give up their free time or whatever time they spend on your project. They are building up skills that you're going to need, that you're needing in your development processes. So these people will know all about the processes that you have inside the company, and you don't. The most important thing is about these people having these skills because they have contributed, you have reviewed their pull requests, all of these things, and even if they are not working on the things that your company has open sourced or your company's contributions, if you see people working on open source projects, it's in your very best interest if you're depending on those open source projects to have these people continue contributing. So you want to ensure that these people don't burn out, maybe because they are doing this in vacation days and free time and weekends. So we want to ensure that these high achieving contributors actually remain on the open source projects your company depends on, because they are just contributors, which means they can leave anytime. What better way there is to keep them on the project than actually pay them for their open source contributions? And a lot of big companies do that. I mean, Alex has mentioned loving the idea of a paycheck. This is how it goes with everybody. They love to get paid for things, and why not get paid for things that you would be doing anyway, we would like to do anyway. And a lot of big companies I know, like, and this doesn't just go for the big companies like Google and IBM, they have actually contributors who are employed to contribute to open source project, like 90% of their time is going on there, because it's the very best interest of their company. So like I said, I'm not saying you should, the sole reason should be for you to treat your open source community well, is to hire them, but it seems to happen quite often, and hiring somebody is not the only way to support them in their open source endeavors. Hiring someone is the last point in which they gradually, from a community perspective, they actually become like paid contributors. On the way there could be various other ways, like they could be contributors that you support monetarily, like maybe give them grants, or take them to hackathons, or bring them together, working together in your company events, Google and Microsoft does a lot of these, like invites those most prolific developers into like events that they hold for them. And they might eventually transition into like a semi-fixed developer role. So not a staff, but maybe a contractor or long-term contractor or like a long-term contributor who is getting paid. And we actually had a lot, this is not my, I didn't find this, I didn't figure this out myself. This you can see in the field like a lot. Last year's DevRelCon London, Joe was talking about how GitHub ended up figuring out that they had a bunch of campus experts and they couldn't scale the program with just Joe alone. Like he was being torn apart, and eventually he can also only exist in a single time zone. Unfortunately, like this is something that we all would like to figure out how to do that and exist in multiple time zones. So they actually, some of their high-achieving campus experts were hired in paid roles to provide paid support in like local areas around the world. The same conference, Martin Gonto was talking about how they are actually paying their contributors. They figured out that, hey, the number one way that we can drive people to adopt our Auth0, this is from Auth0, to adopt our APIs and like spread the word is to drive traffic to our website. So how do we drive traffic to our website? We create nice content. So they figured out that they're gonna do this like high profile blog about stuff, not necessarily about Auth0, but about stuff that developers are interested in. And so what they ended up with, they cannot create all the content. So they were like, hey, if you want to create content for a blog, we'll pay you for it. So you submitted a blog post and you got paid for it. They also have a ambassador program. There's a talk later on about this. I recommend you check that out. We also, in the Mozilla Tech Speakers program, we have things on the other side. You provide people abilities and provide people access to all these things, and you provide them with skills that they can use later on in their own life. So whether or not you're going to be hiring them, these people who you are supporting, you are helping them grow in their developer careers. This was the number one thing that GitHub Education wanted to give to their campus experts, was growing in the open source world. And this is what you can provide by providing support to these people. Shustika is one of my Mozilla Tech speakers who did a lot of work around WebVR. They even co-wrote a book about it. And when she ended up like finishing her university years, she almost instantly got a job as a developer advocate at a company. She couldn't believe it, but that still happened, and for a good reason, because she was out there giving talks as a Mozilla Tech speaker and getting invited to more conferences, growing her skills as a speaker. And this is all our stories. This is not just Shustika's stories, this is me, Alex Lakatos, and a bunch of our people that made this happen. So by now, hopefully I convince you that open source is good, and especially good for you. And open source communities are great, and creating open source communities and supporting them is very important, and like I also mentioned this one earlier. So for all parties involved, for your company, for you, for the people who you're supporting. So the question is, what does it mean to me? So if I had to wrap it up, I would say, find out if you are using open source, and this is like a trick question, because I have just said that you probably are using open source. Just dig down deeper and figure out what are you using open source for, and figure out a way how to pay it forward, how to support those communities. There are a bunch of links and examples that you can do this. I have some examples from Mozilla. Mozilla actually built an open source browser, so it's not hard to imagine that they support open source software. But just recently they launched a program that has a $3 million budget just on supporting like open source software that aligns with Mozilla's goals and initiatives. So if they can do it, like your $1 billion startup or company can also do it. So here are some key takeaways. for your company and for you. If the only thing you take away from this is, provide paid opportunities for your best contributors, don't burn them out, don't just use your contributors, and if you're using open source, pay it forward. If you're a person who is working in open source, don't let companies drain all your energies and don't let these companies to use you. Make sure you get something out of your open source contributions. And when you do get into an open source project, find connections and provide connection points. I would like to tell a story about this in the remaining 3 minutes or so, 2 minutes probably. But those were like the key points that you could take away from this. If you want to know what's all with the duckies, talk to me or Alex Lagatos. We'll be more than happy to tell you. But basically, my story starts, when I first dipped my toe into open source. Started, about talking about dead phones. Windows Phone earlier today. I started heavily contributing to Mozilla when they released their Firefox OS offering, which was a web-based phone operating system, and gradually, I got into more communities, got to know the Mozilla representatives, eventually later I got into tech speakers, but it's very important to find your passion in the projects you want to contribute to, because that will keep you going. If a paycheck won't do it, you'll have to figure out a way to find something that will keep you going. So also, but when you do this, also keep your eyes open for opportunities. This is what happened to me when a slot in the tech speakers program that was just starting at Mozilla 2.5 years ago opened up. Somebody actually got sick and was couldn't continue the program, so I was one of the very first people who could get into the Mozilla Tech Speakers program, in which Mozilla would be trying to support their community contributors to give talks and present about Mozilla technologies and open web technologies most importantly. So some of these opportunities I picked up on the way and cashed in on meant that I managed to get into a place where I currently am. But even when you do eventually end up in a moving from an open source contributor role into like a staff role, it's very important to not forget about your roots. Very important to Alex was speaking about building communities and being part of communities, organizing events. All of those things will have to go on. And you only have 24 hours a day. So figure out a way how to keep those things going. And that way might not necessarily be you doing them anymore. So make sure you're not gatekeeping. Make sure you're raising the communities around you, raising the people around you to be able to fill in the roles when you have to leave those open source roles that you are in. This is a very bad thing in the open source world that happens a lot. A lot of gatekeeping is going on, and it's slowing and it's changing very slowly. So make sure you're not one of those gatekeepers and keep your communities, lift your communities up, and make sure that there are people to take your place when you actually leave a project. And when you are actually hired at a company or like you change jobs, make sure, this is also about keeping your contributors, make sure that you remember those things when you were like an outsider to the company. By being an insider to a company, you get a lot of access to not just resources, but information, a lot of other things. So you have to make sure that these information actually reach the people that are outside of the company. Imagine, remember the things that you had trouble accessing and try making it easier from the inside. And you don't really know at all. Aya has been, and Tomomi also mentioned this today, you might know your own community, but don't let this lull you into thinking that you know all communities. Find those communities around the world and make sure you don't think that you know everybody just because you're coming from one community. So live them. This is Ditruk Ayala, who actually moved to Indonesia for a year to figure out how like Southeast Asia works. He is on the DevRel team from Mozilla, and they realized that they didn't really have a grasp on the Southeast Asian region. So he kept traveling, not just in one country, but actually spent like into several countries. There's a blog post if you want to read it. And Mozilla moved into, you would think they would be offering like a mobile browser for like 5 years. They know everything about mobile browsers. Indonesia proved them wrong, so they have a whole research on this. And you know, at the end of the day, if nothing worse, you know, hire local people. You know, hire the people because they know the local, they know the locals and the culture and the local developers in your community best. You want to have killer products. You have to make sure you don't focus on one thing. You have to make sure, figure out what your users need and act on them. So thank you very much for listening to me, and you'll find the slides here. Master speakers and SL Softworks are the tech speaker and my Twitter account if you want to tweet at us and also talk to us. Thank you.